The I think I was thinking about this from the perspective of someone who hasn't really worked with dynamical systems before, and might work with other types of modeling, so, statistical modeling, or even just data analysis. And it struck me that when I was looking at just the basics of simple harmonic motion and damped harmonic motion, that the way a physicist sets up a problem in the first place is quite different from looking at a bunch of data and sort of doing a regression or whatever. So I thought we could just pause a moment to think about that. And then eventually, just sort of set up what we mean by dynamical system, because in one sense, it's a very vague term, but it does mean a specific way of looking at the world. So I'm assuming most of you have heard these terms: attractor, repeller, bifurcation. They crop up in pop science and things like, and discussions of chaos. So I think it's a reasonable question what these things have to do with the brain. I think several of you already have ideas about that. Um, uh, Eventually, it will be useful to focus on concepts of stability, and associated with that, you often have the concept of an energy function. And when we're discussing learning, there will be the concept of cost functions. So that will be an interesting angle to touch on. Then, and this is a bit of a sort of a punt, in the sense I haven't really thought about how we would do this, but the people in the CNS, in the former CNS department, cognitive and neural systems, that the erstwhile department at BU, we have a kind of mathematically oriented phenomenology when we talk about psychophysics experiments, behavior, visual illusions, auditory illusions. All of us have kind of, partly through the coursework and partly through working on our projects, we have this sort of phenomenology. And interestingly, it's sort of phenomenology in both senses. When physicists use the word phenomenology, they mean something that sort of captures the overall behavior that isn't necessarily accurate at a micro level. So that's one sense of the word phenomenology. And then you have, Husserl and Heidegger, and, describing what the experience is, but in a sort of non-psychologized way. And I think there is productive territory there for a dynamic perspective. Then and this doesn't have to be in any order, but I think that some of what I've been thinking about, and also some papers that I've come across, have used bifurcations and attractors for psychiatric disorders. I've come across one paper, which I'll mention, on depression. So it sort of keeps us grounded if we talk about problems like that. At some point, or even throughout, we'll end up kind of coming across concepts of emergence, catastrophe theory, criticality, self-organized criticality, and chaos. Plenty of papers on this sort of thing, even specifically to do with the brain. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I think that a discussion of attractors will shed light on a debate which has been in the news lately, and just in pop science lately, about goals, intentions, and agency. And the T word, which a lot of people do not like, which is teleology. I've always wondered why there was a problem, given the way I think about attractors, but we'll work our way there. Okay, so I was thinking that at some point we should all feel comfortable looking at a diagram like this that talks about bifurcations and oscillations, in this case in the context of this is the depression paper I was talking about from Helen Meyerberg's group. So we should be comfortable looking at something like this and getting some sense of what it means and how to think about it. Which is very, very high level. Like talking about symptoms and sort of consequences of deep brain stimulation and or SSRIs. And then, so Mac, who is here, I read this paper. I quite liked it, and it structured a lot, much of the argument around the idea of attractors in the thalamocortical system. And I was really happy to see this figure, because like there's a whiteboard in our lab where I drew basically this a few months ago. And I was very pleased to see this because I think that even though high dimensional systems can't really be visualized in the way that you typically want to do for dynamical systems, there's something about this way of thinking that I find very helpful, even specifically for talking about thalamocortical loops in the basal ganglia and the thalamic reticular nucleus. If you don't know what any of those terms are, we'll get there eventually. So I think the other sort of general point, some of you may have heard this joke about different ways of doing science. There's a farmer wants his cows to increase their milk production. And so he asks a biologist, a chemist, and a physicist to come help him. And he asks each of them what their solutions will be. And then they present one by one. The biologist has some selective breeding suggestion. The chemist suggests drugging the cow to enhance the release of milk. And the physicist, meanwhile, has been scribbling away on a whiteboard. And then when it's his turn, he turns around and says, "Consider a spherical cow." So I've like this. If we're concerned with like cleaving very close to reality, very often when you look at a physics model, you're like, well, there are hardly any details here. How can I, map this onto my data? Well, there's a way of using this style of thinking qualitatively, and that's what dynamical systems does. And one example of using that in neuroscience is the Hodgkin-Huxley model. Some people forget that it's a model because it's so successful, but it is in fact just a model. The equivalent circuit is down there. I would like to actually go through the Hodgkin-Huxley papers because I think they're absolutely brilliant. So at some point, it would be nice to go through this in detail. But so this is a 4-dimensional dynamical system with voltage-dependent constants. This is a very hard system to think about, and you can't really plot it except in some kind of, with some simplifying assumptions. But what has been going on since the 70s has been these simplifications where so what's on the right is the Fitzhugh-Nagumo model. Fitzhugh wrote a paper and then Nagumo made an equivalent circuit that produces a lot of the nonlinear oscillation behavior of the Hodgkin-Huxley system. Again, a classic paper, the Fitzhugh paper, which I think it would be worth discussing because it shows how you can systematically and in a principled way reduce the number of dimensions to 2. And when you are using 2 dimensions, you can then use certain visualization techniques and geometric techniques, which some of you may have seen this kind of diagram for understanding action potentials. So those you can't really, those are not exact. If you plot those kinds of figures for the Hodgkin-Huxley model, they're not exact. But for the Fitzhugh-Nagumo, they are. This is another sort of, hand-wavy sort of idea, but I think that when you're modeling and you have access to data, there's like 2 attitudes you can roughly have. One is the regression kind of idea. I came across this just a couple of weeks ago, this systematic analogy between regression and springs, basically. And I wish someone had shown this to me when I was, in undergrad or something, because it's a really elegant way of understanding what regression is. So that's, statistical modeling. But dynamical modeling is somewhat different. And the way I was thinking about it just recently is that with standard statistical models, we are explaining the observables in terms of each other. So we're not really adding anything other than what we've measured and maybe some very, very uncontroversial additional things. Whereas I was looking into the history of even the simple harmonic oscillator, and there's a whole very interesting debate about what forces are, and people were always worried about the fact that they're not visible, are they even real? But physicists have, had great successes with positing invisible causes and starting from that perspective. So another way of thinking about that is that you're capturing sort of just what you see in the real system, versus imagining how an idealized system ought to behave. And here, the reason I use the word ought is because I'm thinking of control systems, which is, initially I had forgotten about this when I thought about this group, but control theory is an excellent kind of bridge between sort of engineering and understanding the biological systems. So does everybody recognize what this is? Would anyone like to guess what this is?
I'll answer if no one else answers.
Okay.
This is how people in the Victorian age made their juice.
Something like that.
I have no idea.
Okay, Karthik.
It's the first example of actually a dynamic control. It's the Watts governor.
Yeah.
So basically, they were using it for engines to regulate their temperature and mechanical force. So
yeah. So James Watt didn't invent the steam engine; he improved it. And one of the key ways that he improved it was with this device. And how it works is really beautiful. One of the problems with steam engines is that they, I believe it's that they overheat. So you want to be able to regulate the injection of fuel or water in order to control how fast the engine moves as the fuel is being consumed. So what this does is, can you see my mouse?
Yes.
So these things are heavy balls, and so as the engine is moving, the way that this is constructed, they move up. But then, because of the force of gravity, there's a point at which the weight of those balls pulls the whole thing down, so that the faster the thing moves, the more the balls move up. But then you have a countervailing force in the opposite direction. That is the basis of cybernetics. And so there's an interesting history here. James Clerk Maxwell was the first to kind of look at the Watt governor in a theoretical sense as something very important. And he wrote an essay, which I haven't read, but I think might be worth reading at some point when we talk about control. And then when Norbert Wiener was coining a name for his new field, he took the idea of the governor and he went to the Greek equivalent of that word. So the Kouberos or Kaiberos is the oarsman of a ship who governs how the ship moves, and so that's where the word cybernetics came from. Another maybe Karthik will know this, but does anybody know what this is? What this is a graph of?
Aurora? Like, is this the KP index? Or?
It looks real familiar.
Damped harmonic oscillator.
It may end up like that in some circumstances, but ideally it won't. It's a PID controller. We have a couple of engineers here, so they know what they probably plenty of experience with this. So PID controller is a controller that works based on the proportional, integral, and derivative of some signal. And so the idea is that something turns on at time t is equal to 0, and you want something to maintain it at a particular level. The Watt governor works, I believe, based on just proportional control. When you have proportional control, you end up never quite making a 0 error. You keep sort of oscillating near it. Whereas if you add an integrator and a differentiator, you get more fine control. And this is sort of the gold standard of control in many analog applications. The reason I bring this up is that when you think about motor control or any kind of stabilization, this type of process is worth keeping in mind. So that's another sort of thing that we can get to at some point. So now getting to sort of the specifics of how we talk about all this, there's an important distinction to be made between discrete and continuous systems. When we simulate, we are often, using Euler method or Runge-Kutta to simulate, and it seems like, well, it must be the discrete systems and continuous systems are the same, but the theory shows that they aren't. And a classic example, I'm guessing many of you have seen this image and have been quite baffled by it. I know that when I read, I think Gödel, Bach, I saw this and I was like, I could never quite wrap my head around what was being depicted, and I still get confused whenever I look at it. But it's a bifurcation diagram, and one idea is that we'll find out exactly what it means. You guys have all heard about chaos theory. Deterministic chaos is the idea that small changes in initial conditions or parameter choices can lead to wildly different trajectories given enough time. And that's observable in discrete systems in 2 dimensions. Whereas
in 1D.
Oh, right, yeah, in 1D. But in if I correct me if I'm wrong, but you need 3 dimensions.
That's
for
right.
For that to be the case in
That's right. Yes.
in continuous systems. So it's something to keep in mind. For now, initially, I think we'll stick to continuous systems because that's how most people model real spiking and firing rate based models. But this crops up in places where a discrete approximation might, give you something that you didn't expect based on continuous intuition. So a good way to start, I'm guessing all of you have at least seen differential equations and worked with them graphically or just solved them with code. The interesting thing is that some of the simplest ones you learn, like such as in the start of this book, start with just Newton's second law. I was talking to Ryan about this, that there's something quite amazing about the richness of the descriptive power that starts with just force is equal to mass times acceleration. A couple of days ago, I went down a rabbit hole just trying to find out where that came from. But that's quite a long story, but and worth looking into if you're curious. But so it wasn't just looking at say the data of lots of things that accelerate. There were some hypotheses and in a sense you needed to again step away from reality in order to kind of to get to this law, because for many types of motion, because the friction dominates, you don't necessarily capture this relationship. So you can rearrange that by replacing acceleration with the calculus version of that, d square x over dt square, which I've done here. And then I pop in Hooke's law. Are all of you familiar with Hooke's law? It's basically the idea, which again sort of doesn't hold for all springs or all rigid bodies, but that the restoring force of a spring is proportional to the amount of displacement, and Robert Hooke observed that. So all you have to do is combine these 2 laws and you get a differential equation. If you solve it, you'll get sinusoidal motion as the solution, as infinitely many solutions. And then you have, if you add the more realistic damping, which is a term that is proportional to the velocity, this B term here, you have the damped harmonic oscillator. Actually, I was looking, I didn't have time to look in, but is there a good explanation for why friction is proportional to velocity? Maybe Ryan, one of the physics.
It's not always the case, But
Okay.
I think if you are at like a low Reynolds number, then it's like velocity, which you can reason by dimensional analysis. You can write it in terms of like the viscosity of, like, imagine it's inside like a gooey fluid, right? Then you have this kind of behavior. But in air, most times it would be like velocity squared, maybe.
Oh, okay. Okay.
It's usually for Reynolds numbers less than 10,000 that you would use something like this, right?
Right. Maybe like a really fast moving spring in air would be would have a different law.
Okay. Okay. Cool. So he starts by looking at that, and I don't know how much more I put in here, but so there's some terminology when we're dealing with differential equations that we just try to get out of the way. An ordinary differential equation is a function where you're doing the derivative with respect to just one variable, typically time. Partial differential equations, you have two or more variables, often it's space. So the heat equation is an example of a partial differential equation. Those are much harder to solve. They do show up in neuroscience in certain, if you're interested in, say, the spread of excitation and things like that. But for now, we won't delve into that scary territory. The term first order means that we're only talking about first order derivatives. So second order means that the highest derivative has the second order. And linear means all the non-derivative terms that are, say, you can arrange them on the right side of the equation. They are all powers, unitary powers of one. So in the case of the pendulum, we often think of that as a classic example of simple harmonic motion, but it involves an approximation, because the real system has a nonlinear term, the sine of this angle theta. So what people often do is approximate and get an equation which is the same as that the spring equation. We can talk about that a little bit. So based on number of variables and nonlinearity, Strogatz has sort of laid out all these different phenomena, and sort of everything sort of fits in here in some sense, if you're interested in time varying systems. So the very simple things like the linear oscillator, RC circuit, have very few variables. As you increase, you have these other classic physics systems, and then at this boundary you have all sorts of things that fall under the heading of complex systems. And so a lot of what we computational neuroscientists work with are these neural networks and also reaction diffusion systems. If we are interested in well, even with neural dynamics, you can see reaction diffusion phenomena, but also, say, release of neurotransmitters or chemical species, and patterning with respect to genetics and genetic species. So a lot of what the neuroscientists are up to lives out here. That's all I put together just as an intro. So does anyone have any questions or comments about anything or just suggestions, because we can then look into a little bit more detail about what Strogatz talks about.
So I noticed that epilepsy is on this diagram. So he's already thinking about some kind of neuroscience application.
Yeah. So exactly. Yeah. And I guess when you say neural networks, it includes both biological and the artificial ones. The artificial neural networks typically don't have that particularly interesting dynamics, because they always work in this asymptote regime.
No, unless it's specifically from the dynamical systems like definition, whatever people do as artificial neural networks now, the deep nets and all that, they are not dynamical at all. They're just algebraic passes, right? So you're not
Right.
really working with time in any meaningful way. So
Right.
Recurrent networks have dynamical systems in them.
they're more, you could say they're kind of like maps, but they're kind of a hodgepodge, right? In the sense that they have a forward pass, which is purely algebraic, and then they do the whole, looping back in some like computery way of like feedback, and then gradient descent happens on top of it. It doesn't kind of fit into this either continuous or discrete map idea that people usually talk about in dynamical systems in any easy way. It's sort of more a hodgepodge idea than really a proper dynamical system.
If you ignore the weight updating, a recurrent neural network that operates over time data is a discrete time dynamical system.
Yeah, you can say that it's an iterated map in that sense, yes. But like if you also include the learning, it kind of is doing an algebraic step followed by a gradient descent, which is just chain rule, and then some time operation, and then it's sort of like 3 different things are happening in 3 different time domains, basically. So
Sure, but the iterated map is a dynamical system.
yeah.
I recently read a paper that said that you can approximate RNNs by a line attractor specifically for sentiment classification, but I thought that would be interesting to add to the discussion.
They were doing what? Classifying sentiment?
Yes, of sentences.
You have a link to the paper?
Yeah, I can probably pull it up.
Well,
Why did they use a line attractor?
I
So-
suppose because you want a whole parameter of possible sentiments.
I mean, if I remember right, this paper actually they found the line attractor in there in the RNN. Not they didn't put it in there as to begin with.
Yeah, correct. Sorry. Yeah, I guess the best
Oh,
way of
interesting.
putting it is that they effectively found that you can very easily understand, I guess, what is going on with the line attractors, and the two were operated in very similar ways at the end of the day, as in the representations versus the line attractor.
So yeah, so these are some things that we can get to when we want to talk about the sort of cognitive, perceptual, and things like that. But maybe we should. What's a good? Would anyone like to just define what an attractor is, just for completeness? Oh yeah. If anyone needs to leave, it's been an hour. So I figure we'll do 1.5 hour sessions, and then I'll leave a few minutes for questions, comments, whatever. But yeah, so would anyone like to offer a definition of attractor? Since we use it, Karthik, you do it.
No, let others do it all. I don't want to be talking all the time. Come on, take a chance, guys. Come on.
Yeah.
I mean, I can do it. I just am not 100% sure it'll be exactly what you're looking for.
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay, the way I understand an attractor is effectively the derivative there is 0. So once you get there, you're not going to leave that area.
Yes. So I'm just throwing this out there, but these are like sort of simple questions. When do you have a situation where the derivative is 0 but is not an attractor? Or it's not a complete attractor?
When it's repelling? I mean, we
yes.
have those two, right?
Yes, it's repelling. There's one more situation which is interesting to keep in mind.
The saddle?
Yes, the inflection point. So you might have something that curves, stops, and then keeps going. So dealing with those kinds of situations is a big part of what a bifurcation is.
And there is another, maybe we'll go through it maybe later. The other important thing is attractors are not necessarily just about a single point. It's that if you're in the vicinity of that point, you will eventually go there. That's not true for conservative system. So attractor is very much something that you'll only see for a dissipative system. So that's another thing for people to keep in mind. Fixed points and all the like stable points and centers, they are not attractors. So attractor means it has a basin around which, if you're going to be there, you'll eventually get into that state fixed point or whatever other notion of an attractor.
So
This-
can the neighbor, oh, sorry.
Arvind, yeah.
So can the neighborhood be quantified? Like, how do you say, when you say vicinity, what do you mean? Like for different systems, would it be, can you actually quantify and say, okay, if you are, I mean, yeah, that's my question. Can you?
In some systems, it's
Okay.
like you can define what is the extent of the basin of attraction, where if you're close to that, or if you eventually enter that spot, you're going to be eventually getting to that point or the well or whatever, whichever way you visualize it. But in general, you cannot make that statement. All you can say is that there is a basin of attraction. So that's why maybe the other idea is that it is a qualitative aspect that we'll always have to keep in mind more than the quantitative notions that people usually have with, any data fit to their to a dynamical model. So it's like you get more qualitative important concepts rather than just purely like quantitatively exactly, oh, it's like x equal to 0.001 is when I will reach. It's kind of not like that. It's kind of like the same way you define an infinitesimal, right? So yeah, people have to keep that in mind.
At the risk of having too much text on the screen, I'm going to share the actual book. And so what Karthik just said, so so what he's doing is just comes up with a sort of simple system that has a derivative proportional to the sign of the quantity. And he shows the actual mathematical solution, because in this case, it can be constructed. It's not always the case. In fact, the majority of differential equations in some sense cannot be solved exactly in this way. But when you look at an equation like this, where instead of x in terms of t, you have t in terms of x, it's not easy to interpret what's happening. So you can instead look at how the derivative varies with respect to the quantity of interest, and then plot out where the derivative moves forward because it's positive, and where it moves in the other direction because it's negative. And so that is just captured here. And in places where you have arrows that converge, you have an attractor, and where they diverge from a point, you have a repeller. That's, how many of you got a chance to look at this? Most of you, some of you have already read it. So
I was wondering if you could provide more concrete examples that might serve to ground some of the more general equations that the equations would match up to, something quantitative and ideally as simple as possible and as intuitive.
So I'll just I won't bring up that slide again, but basically, so think about that spring. We have an intuition of how springs work, and so let's assume that it's damped, but even if it wasn't, and let's say we're pulling it horizontally, so we're not really dealing with gravity for now. It's on a table, there's some weight attached to it, and when you pull it in one direction, it swings in the other direction. So that, let's say that you've picked a convention where x is when you're pulling it, so it's stretched in that direction. You know that the force is restoring to pull it back to where it started. So in that situation, if you look at the derivative, which is the rate of change of x, right? When it's on one side of x, it's going to point in that direction. When it's on the other side, it will point in the opposite direction. So it's always restoring with respect to that center, that sort of average point of x.
Is there a collection of other examples? Because the spring is a pretty easy, intuitive example, but I think providing more examples that
you can go for a pendulum. That's a good example as well, but it again follows the same kind of physical laws that Johan talked about with respect to springs and balls and all that. The other thing, I think we can talk about the whole predator-prey models. Maybe that will give us a better sense of how things, when they interact, how systems where there is interaction, how that works. So yeah, maybe when we...
Oh, okay. I can pull out.
So before that, there is a question from Brian. Anyone can answer.
Yeah.
Are simple dynamical systems like this supposed to be visually interpretable, or is it often too backwards to visualize and should instead be understood purely algebraically?
Good, very good question. Anyone?
I mean, I think one of the things I like about dynamical systems is that it's very visual, because a lot of the, you're always in a higher than 2 or 3 dimensional system. Like, obviously you're losing something when you visualize, but often the interactions, often the system can be represented in a very meaningful way in 2 dimensions, and looking at the 2-dimensional system tells you a lot about the behavior of the system in a way an equation wouldn't be able to. So you're going to be doing a lot of drawing things when you're trying to understand different dynamical systems, and I like that a lot.
And there is the other idea, we'll probably get to that, which is that it's kind of like a bizarre thing where instead of looking at like individual trajectories of like where you will land somewhere, if you have the space in which, if you can visualize the space in which it's actually moving, well, you're kind of visualizing the entire system. So it's sort of like, it gives you a shorthand for, like if you look at the phase space, you're basically, the entire system as well, especially in simpler like visualizable systems like 2D or 3D systems. So that's also an added advantage of visualization. You don't really have to worry about like, chugging through the algebra or the calculus, because once you see the phase space or how things flow, if you have a map of it in every local point in that space, then you kind of know everything. So, but again, that works very well for 2D and 3D. You have to do a little more tricks, as like Julia was pointing out, for higher dimensional systems, but even those are very informative for you to gain some idea about what's going on. So visualization is important.
Ryan suggested a classic example of where the derivative is proportional to the negative of some gradient. So I like to think of those as, the ball in a bowl kind of idea, where the bowl represents the potential. But the physical intuition is that, just imagine that you have a marble in a bowl with a fair amount of friction, just to keep it simple. The tendency of the marble is to head towards the bottom of the bowl. And so wherever the marble is, its derivative of its movement, let's imagine it's a perfectly sort of spherical kind of thing, wherever the derivative of the angle, whatever the angle is with respect to, say, the center of that bowl, the direction in which the restoration occurs is negative, so that it pushes it towards the middle. That's a classic. So the generalization of the abstraction then is, once you have this idea of the marble in a bowl, we shift to the idea that the marble now is not a thing, but a point in a phase space. So we're going to use this term phase space all the time. What is phase space? Phase space is just laying out all the possibilities, all the conceivable possibilities for that particular system. When you actually look at the equations and constraints on the system, some of those regions of that phase space may actually be impossible. But you sort of initially lay out that. And in neuroscience, sometimes we use that interchangeably with state space. So phase space, state space. So point in the phase space picks out the current state. And a trajectory is, just a line or a in there which is the time evolution of the system in the possibility space. And So when there's an attractor, what that means is that in the space of all the possibilities, it tends to converge on some region or a specific point in the case of a point attractor. Like for a single neuron, let's imagine that it doesn't have any particularly exotic currents, and it's a type 1 neuron. So a type 1 neuron has a linear frequency response, meaning that for however weak your input is, there's some possibility of it producing a spike. So the only limitation on measuring what the spike rate is how long you're willing to wait while stimulating the neuron. So I inject current, and then I wait, and I see a spike. But you can also have a slightly stronger spike, and you bump the voltage up. The effect of all the currents will be to restore the membrane potential back to its resting state. So you can think of, I like to think of the membrane as sort of the venue of a kind of tug of war, mediated by the sodium and potassium channels, basically. So the weird voltage dependencies is what makes it a kind of strange rubber rather than just, rigid rope. But the net effect of the sodium rushing in and the potassium rushing, is that right, Karthik? The sodium rushes in?
Yes.
Okay. The sodium rushes, I always get the signs of these things wrong. Sodium rushes in, the potassium rushes out. And so the net effect of all of that is to, so when you say take away the stimulating current, so it's just a sort of temporary bump in input, it will tend back towards the resting state. That's an attractor. And in the exact solutions you can look at for the Fitzhugh-Nagumo, just 2 dimensions, you can see that happening. But you also see a different type of attractive system called a limit cycle, which we'll talk about it more later, in more detail maybe. But a limit cycle is where the system will tend towards not a stable point, such as quiescence in the case of a neuron, but sort of repetitive firing. So you just keep firing.
Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, what were you going to say?
Yeah, so I think I'll also answer Arvind's point with that. So the attractor, they come in varieties. So the ones that we know very well is the easiest one is a fixed point. So that's just one point where you are like going to eventually go into. And then there are line attractors where you're just going along a single path and you'll always remain on that line in whichever dimension you might be in. It could be some kind of a straight line in that whatever the phase space, the manifold in that phase spaces. The limit cycle is a special case of an attractor too. The limit cycle is basically saying that you're only going to hit certain points, and I don't know whether we need a technical definition for it, but the technical definition for an attractor is it has volume 0. So topologically, it's a volume 0 space. So a limit cycle is one that has a volume 0. And it's basically some elaborate cycle. In the phase space, it will actually look like a closed curve. That's what a limit cycle is. And it can take any elaborate forms, and depending on the nonlinearity and all that stuff. So those are the ones that are known for 2D, 3D, all that. And then as you go higher and higher, the attractors can get stranger. In fact, the other attractor in 3D is called the strange attractor. So, and beyond that, it's anybody's guess how systems behave. So that's broadly the idea about attractors. But again, there's a very important thing, which is that something that is going around perpetually around a point or maintaining a particular trajectory is not an attractor system. That's something that people should understand. It's not a system which is conserved in energy is not an attractor system. Only a system which has dissipation has attractors. So that's a very important distinction, both mathematically and physically. And that's why limit cycles are very important, because people using Fourier analysis or Fourier theory usually study harmonics based on sines and cosines and all that. Harmonic oscillators are kind of linear oscillators. You can churn out the frequency of your sines and cos, but every real world oscillator has to kind of self-sustain. So like you can't slightly perturb your heart and just go into exponential mode and burst a iota, whatever, right? So you can't be running and then you can't die all the time. So all real world oscillators have to have a limit cycle, and limit cycles will only come in a nonlinear system. So as any self-sustaining or self-oscillatory system admits a limit cycle. So it's a very, very well, without that, those systems will be structurally unstable. So that's a very important thing to know. Yeah.
Do you guys have you guys heard of the Lotka-Volterra system, the predator-prey model? Predator-prey model does not have an attractor or a limit cycle, because when you perturb the population, like so the way it works is that you set up the foxes and rabbits or whatever with this coupled pair of equations, for all, I think all parameters other than 0, you get a cycle of the two populations. And what you can do is you can perturb it by manually increasing the number of rabbits or foxes. You will just move the system to a new cycle. It will not return to the old cycle that it was at. So it's a sort of memoryless system. So another way of thinking about an attractor is in terms of hysteresis to a degree. Very, very simple systems like the potential system that Ryan mentioned may have only one well, meaning that the entire universe is a basin. So that wherever you place the system initially, if you wait enough time, it will reach the bottom of the basin. There are no systems like that, basically. But so instead, what you imagine is a kind of geography of many valleys divided by ridges of various thickness. So a system has a certain stability up to a perturbation that makes it jump out of one valley and into another, which means that it's moving from one attractor to another. And so perturbations help you in a qualitative way understand whether the system has an attractor, because but if the perturbation is too large, you may bump it out of the attractor state that it was into a new one.
Does basically every system with negative feedback or balancing feedback modeled by an attractor at that feedback point? So I'm thinking biological homeostasis processes like temperature, like when you get hot, you sweat, and that brings you back to the original temperature, which is an attractor at that temperature. Or if you get too cold, you shiver, brings you back up. So that would be an example. Is pretty much every negative feedback an attractor?
I believe so. Well, I think so.
No, you can have like a limit cycle, like Johan was saying. Like
yes.
you could have a bad controller that overshoots, right? Like imagine something like a thermostat, like you're saying, that like overshoots the target temperature, and then starts to cool down, and then overshoots it in the other direction. And it's possible that it doesn't have enough, like it doesn't react fast enough, or for some reason that it has a limit cycle rather than like eventually stabilizing at what you set it to. It's very common in control.
Yeah, like in the predator model, the predators
but
serve
limit
as a
cycle
form of negative feedback on prey growth.
So a thermostat is not would not be modeled as an attractor in a dynamical system if it only turns on at 2 degrees over and then cools to 2 degrees under and always is going around but never hits your target.
No, that's fine. I think it's still, you can make the case that it is still around the vicinity of an attractor. So I don't think we have to outrightly reject it. And I'm not sure why we should be so worried about a limit cycle. A limit cycle is also an attractor. It's just it's an elaborate attractor where the attractor is no longer a single point. It can take any of those values which are in which it is going to be stable. It's basically you're doing some sort of a repetitive motion. The way your heart beats. I mean, your heart is not beating to a fixed point. It has enough leeway to like beat between whatever it's 55 beats per minute to 125 beats per minute. I'm just making the number up, but it's fine within that regime, even though it might have things that might not look oscillatory. It can return back to one or a few other modes. So all those modes are stable modes. So it's fine. Yeah, the only thing you have to be careful is not all negative feedback ensures attractors. So that's not always the case. It can go into a degenerate system where it's basically always going to zero. So we are not really interested in things going to like complete rest. We're not interested in like nonlinear dynamics. People are not studying things that go to complete rest, right? You don't want homeostasis to be where everything has just gone to zero and there is death, basically like heat death. You don't want that either. So that's why like line attract, something like a limit cycle becomes important.
So
and that's why that's.
Am I?
Stefan?
I was going to say, am I correct in thinking that you could also design a system with negative feedback, say like a delayed amplified sort of negative feedback that rather than falling into a stable point or a limit cycle, effectively spirals out and diverges? And so there would actually be no stability, but there would still be negative feedback.
Yeah, you have that. Yeah, you'll have
That's
that.
what I was thinking of.
So bifurcation, like if for certain bifurcations, you can have such attractors where if you're not exactly in the vicinity of the limit cycle, you're always going to be unstable. You can go off, or you can go and you have heat death basically. So
but I think what Kale is asking is, does restorative force ensure attractive dynamics? And I think the answer is no, because of the overcompensation that can lead you could lead you out. But I think those systems might need to be driven. I'm not 100% sure about that. Like if you have something that is that where the overshoots are so large on the other side that your compensations are leading you to a larger and larger oscillation.
Right, you're definitely heating the system,
right.
So you have to be putting energy into it.
Right.
So yeah, once you start including drives, it is a little more tricky to talk about. A driven system is not easier to analytically solve or understand. It becomes much more tricky.
When we say dissipative, the idea is that the system primarily like loses energy. If it's gaining energy in these other ways, all these other things are possible. Or it's some sort of steady reservoir of energy that certain structures allow for it. So that's when you can get all these negative feedback seeming like positive feedback because of that. But that's a really good thing to clarify. But what Karthik was saying about limit cycles is that the main thing one wants to draw attention to is the pulling towards, and whether it's a point or a limit cycle is sort of less crucial. It's the idea that when you perturb the system within a zone, which we call a basin, it returns there. So the size of the basin of attraction could be a basin for a limit cycle or a point. How that relates to, does anyone want to talk about how that relates to machine learning?
Oh, I can do my best now that that's my thing. No, actually, no, I can't. I immediately forgot the question because it's kind of late. I was gonna say something about like learning rate and convergence, and how you presumably want your, I mean, machine learning is just you're trying to fit a model of some sort. What the underlying model is could be any number of equations, but you're fitting an equation, it's regression. And so you're going to be iterating over and adjusting, trying to narrow some kind of error. And in the case that your learning rate is too high, you're going to be continually overshooting the error and overfitting to new data. And so generally lower learning rates avoid that problem, but then you have the case that you need a lot of iterations to learn. So yeah, was that what we were talking about?
More or less. The only thing I would add is the thermal noise idea. So I think we'll aim to end at 10:30, and we'll just end on this point and questions if anyone has any. In learning, what you're effectively trying to do is put the system in a new configuration that is different from what it started. So you want it to explore. How you do that is, you've heard of gradient descent and stochastic gradient descent. So that's the system exploring its state space. And the stochastic part is that you add noise because you have the concept of local minima. So imagine that you're in a mountainous region and you're blindfolded and you're trying to reach the lowest point, the absolute lowest point in the entire region. How might you do this? So you might, and this is how the algorithm actually works. You have a sense that you've moved down. Yeah, and so that is a completely local sense. You don't have any sense of the overall landscape. So you move downwards. And then if your next step after moving downwards is you move back up again, then that means you've reached a minimum, but it may not be the lowest point. So you need to add a certain amount of noise, as they call it, thermal noise in this context, so that you also occasionally hop out of little valleys and find the lowest valley. So the desired state in a learning algorithm can be understood from the perspective of a sort of attraction.
And I want to clarify that we're talking about weight space and not activity space.
Right. Yeah, that's important actually. Yeah.
Johan?
Yes.
Just a little different topic. For some people said they didn't have much math background and they still wanted to learn about chaos.
Yeah.
This Arthur Strogatz, he has given a course it's called the Great Courses, right? Which you can get it through the internet, and he goes through the whole book. It's like 23 half-hour sessions. He avoids all the detailed math, but gets all the concepts and goes through both the fractals and the chaos theory, and explains historical perspective and also the applications and everything. So for people who want to not go deep into the math, this Great Course is a very good way of getting to know this book and this subject. Just wanted to let you know.
Excellent. So this is just the preamble. This is more like a sort of a taster of the concepts that we'll try and go through a little bit more detail, and make good on the promise that there's lots of visual intuition. So for instance, when we're dealing with a two-dimensional system, you can have a field where every point is associated with an arrow pointing to where the system will tend towards. And one way that I like to think about it as a kind of physical analogy is that, imagine that it's water that's sort of swirling and moving. Then you may have sinks and you may have sources. So when you have a sink, well, like imagine you place a piece of cork on some region of say this large tub. If there's water that's sort of leaking out, eventually the cork will reach that point where the sink is. That's one other way of thinking about what's happening with an attractor. And if you have a source, on the other hand, you have a repeller from that point, because the cork won't stay there. So we can show how the diagrams talking about dynamical systems look like that. So it's not a difficult analogy to make more concrete.
Yeah, and in general, the idea is this, right? The goal is all of us kind of get to speed with 1D, 2D, and 3D systems. But then all the interesting things are really high dimensional, where you could say to a large extent, most of the things you learn from 1D, 2D, and 3D might not even be useful. directly, but kind of the concepts of an attractor or a repeller or a bifurcation will become extremely useful. But you can't really visualize them. Those attractors are no longer going to be looking like a simple limit cycle or an attractor, a fixed point attractor or anything. These are, geometrically in manifolds that are not going to be easy for us to visualize at all. So the analytical tools that will come in or that are needed to be developed will also be very, very different. And we don't fully have an understanding at all. When I say we don't, it's not just us, but the whole math community of people who are doing dynamical systems as well. So it's anyone who is very math-minded. You also have a lot of important problems to solve in this field. So it's also an open field in that sense.
I have a question about the pace of this discussion group. Are we going to go through Strogatz approximately 1 chapter per week?
For now, and I think at some point I would like to intersperse the Strogatz with some neuroscience specific kind of papers. So I was thinking it might get a little technical, but maybe we can do a sort of broad overview of the Hodgkin-Huxley paper. And that way we can also mix up the math with some, actual nuts and bolts kind of, biological, recording kind of stuff. We can just talk about those experiments and how they modeled it, which is not very illuminating from the dynamical systems perspective, but we'll use that as a sort of prep to read the Fitzhugh paper, so that we get a sense of how and why moving to this simpler two-dimensional system gives you some insight, and couple that with some ideas Isakevich in his textbook used to show there's a really weird little prediction made using dynamical systems theory about silencing a tonically firing neuron by exciting it. I used that as a demonstration in a guest lecture I taught, and a lot of people found it really counterintuitive. So we can talk about that. So after maybe a couple of weeks of Strogatz, we'll sort of add some neuroscience papers to sort of take those ideas out in the wild, sort of. And suggest papers if you have, or if you come across something to do with bifurcations, attractors, whatever that you've read in neuroscience or cognitive science, and you'd like the group to discuss it, send it along and we can add it. So like I said, it's a part sort of tutorial, part journal club, and we'll see how it evolves. How does that sound?
So I think Eli, am I saying your name correctly? Eli sent a paper that
was just in regards to the line attractor descriptions. It's quite an interesting paper to think about when they're talking about saccadic movements and how they describe the fact that a line attractor could in fact explain why we're seeing these movements on this particular axis and the drifting that they see and stuff. I just found it quite interesting to think about. It's one of the earlier papers I remember reading. People trying to apply the language of attraction to the brain at that sort of large scale.
Yeah.
And in general, and we've talked a lot about the details of attractors, and we talk about the canonical examples of dynamical systems and what have you. But when you come to tackle a neuroscience problem, they're just so nebulous. I mean, you can start at the cellular level, or you can go up to like mean field models, which sort of springboards off the back of things like the central limit theorem and diffusion equations and the Fokker-Planck and all that jazz. But the languages of attractors, repulsors, manifolds, I mean, I find I get so much bang for the buck having learned a lot about these things. Like even things like quite simply Max left now actually sadly, but he thinks about the arousal system in the brain, which involves these subcortical structures that's like the thalamus and the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. But there's also brainstem structures like the locus ceruleus, which is a neuroadrenergic structure. It basically just sends up activity in this really umbrella-like fashion to the cortex. And it ties in with what Johan and others were saying about getting stuck in local minima. You can think about the brain like we have here as a marble in some sort of potential space. And you've got this really evolutionarily old system that sits smack bang on the top of your brainstem that a lot of other creatures have. And it says, all right, you've got this cool cortex that can do all this amazing stuff. Maybe you get stuck in this mode of thought, but you need to divert your attention to this new task. It just so happens when you jump between tasks, there's lots of evidence showing your pupils expand in response to this injection of noradrenaline. And it's kind of like tempering in machine learning algorithms. Tempering is basically, as far as I understand it, you have some sort of phase space, you've got some manifold of attraction, And you don't want your system to get stuck in this sort of local minima. You want it to be able to move around and sample the space more completely. You can do that with an injection of extra energy, adding stochasticity. Equally, you can flatten the landscape, and that can be done like as an average temperature increase in your system. If you turn the temperature up everywhere and then turn it back down again and just do this like sort of pulse of average energy, non-specific activity, you can prevent your system from getting stuck, or just allow it to move more freely and sample the space more completely. So in the context of like a novel cognitive task, something you don't know the answer to, but you want to try some things, that exploration is nicely cast in this description of attractors and their modulation, and thinking about manifolds. I don't know, we've talked a lot here about how your brain only sort of carries you to that three-dimensional manifold description, and then you kind of get lost. But it turns out that I've found a lot of bangs, still being able to walk back and say, all right, I'm thinking of the marble, I'm thinking of the sheet, and I'm thinking how it moves. And the same is true of things like space-time and gravity and so on and so forth. I mean, they're just nice ways of orienting yourself before you walk out into the unknown and start grabbing a limb of the elephant. If anyone knows that analogy.
That's exactly how I think, basically, and how my modeling works. So he mentioned saccades, Eli. One of the models I developed was about abnormal eye movements in schizophrenia, and I used a sort of cybernetic model basically, and with spiking, but I had to remove the part where I mentioned I used the attractor metaphor because of brevity. but we can talk about that a little bit later. The idea that you can interpret things like simple things like eye movements, and more complicated things potentially like the trajectory of a thought, or something simpler like movement, in terms of certain metaphors from dynamical systems, such as the depth and width of an attractor basin. So if you want to protect a state, let's say you don't want to be very distracted, what you'd like is to have pretty high walls in some sense, so that when distractors, which are the perturbations, come in, at best you're temporarily deviated from what you're doing, and then you go back. Whereas in situations where you want to be alert or vigilant, you want the opposite, because it may be that you want to sort of have like a tripwire response to the sound of a twig breaking, because you know there's a tiger nearby. So in the case of human beings, using not human beings, animals, human beings, this sort of ability to sort of tweak the knob of the parameters of the attractors is, I find a very helpful way to think about flexibility in behavior. So we will get there too.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's been a lot of work on criticality in the brain, talking about this sort of flattening of attraction, when, like you say, when you get that sensitivity to novel input, but you don't always want that. In my subjective experience, sometimes I don't want to be sensitive to any input. I just want to be in my zone, in my head. And the brain, as far as I see it, there's a lot of, actually Mac's been on some papers showing, I'm doing some of this work, but yeah, that dial is like being twisted by these evolutionarily old structures, allowing you to, leverage some specificity, but also have that flexibility. And that's why it makes it such an interesting complex system, because it's really one of those few that, as far as we know, that can do this. It has this feature to it. It's not overly sensitive all the time. It's not undersensitive all the time. And it's got to balance that. Like, it can't be the case that the brain, people say, oh, it's pretty much a critical system. Basically what you're saying there is it's like something sitting on a pinhead, and a little perturbation, the thing will run away. So that would be the really responsive system. But we don't have any evidence that the brain, in fact, does that. It has a lot of things like critical systems have, like, I don't know if we'll get into it, but like avalanche theory and criticality, where you talk about adding when you add a perturbation to your system, in the avalanche case, it's a grain of sand. You can kind of, the types of avalanches, like if you had a sand pile and you drop the sand grain, you might get a little jiggle of the sand as they sort of collide, and then it'll settle back down to an equilibrium. Or you might get a large avalanche. And the distribution of, or the probability of the avalanche size that you get has this really interesting mathematical scale relationship. And people have argued that this is evident in the brain at times, but to some extent it can't be, because you have this resiliency to, you don't go into a seizure or something when a small perturbation comes about. I mean, there are cases where you can put in certain stimuli and probably induce one with a visual stimuli or something like that, but in the right people. But yes, there's some compromise that's going on. That biology is an imperfect realization of a lot of these concepts, but it doesn't mean the concepts themselves aren't incredibly useful. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the brain is very near something like a critical point. And it might be you needed some new language that we've done a bit of work on, like Others have called quasi-criticality. I don't know how you want to think of it, but when you have this heterogeneity, which the brain undoubtedly has, it's not like the sandpile model. There's not this perfect thing where the grains drop on the same position all the time and the grains all have the same properties. There's all sorts of heterogeneity throughout the brain, cell diversity, and to some extent, it might be biology's hack to protecting itself against these runaway effects because it's so non-uniform. But it also means that things like a critical point are stretched out into like large regimes where you can multiple parameter combinations can buy you effectively these same computational benefits, like the sensitivity that we've talked about here, or responsiveness, for lack of a better word.
I feel like everything Eli said is almost mission statement for, if anyone feels like this was they were a little bit, it was a bit over their heads, we should feel comfortable understanding pretty much everything he said after a few weeks, months, ideally. So, you know, jot down, take a note of anything that you thought was totally baffling, and we'll try and get to it. Just email me if you want something specifically to be enlarged, and we'll kind of we'll go slowly initially, and then we'll add the journal club aspect with specific papers so that we show how to talk about things in this way.
So one of the things that we are kind of,
well, it's 10:40, so if people want to leave, don't feel obliged to stay. We'll just say that the rest is just sort of planning for the next session.
So yeah, one of the things,
I'm not in any hurry to stick around until people feel like they need to leave.
So one of the things that we are kind of interested in, like at least getting by the end of this series, is can we, I mean, Eli said it best, because it's sort of like the brain is not necessarily functioning as a completely stable system. It's not a fully in the mode of an attractor either. It is not fully in the domain of criticality. It is not. So this whole quasi regime that it seems to operate in, and many biological systems operate in. I think like Charlie is very interested in these kinds of questions, especially quasi attractors and quasi criticality and all that stuff. These are in both mathematical terms as well as purely like, you know, physical phenomenological terms. They are very under theorized, and I think we have a lot of scope through our discussion here to kind of try to at least come up with a framework, if not like outrightly like solve it or something, at least for whatever problems that we are interested in. We should be able to have a sort of framework where we can address these questions meaningfully, whether it's neuroscience for us or for other people in other fields. So sort of one of the main motivations for Johan and myself and others to actually kind of kickstart this thing is to, like, yeah, we can learn all the mathematical ideas that are there, but somehow they don't really fit well into the existing, you know, the biological systems. So what new concepts need to be added or can be derived from what exists? So I think that's something that we are very actively pushing for, and that's like one of the main goals of this work, this whole project here. So in case people are wondering what we are doing here, that's kind of the idea here. We kind of want to talk about quasi-criticality and quasi-attractors and quasi-states and quasi-stability, and you put a quasi in front of everything. So that's kind of where we are going.
Maybe if these are all abstract sounding words, one after the other in a string, we can say something like this. The way I like to think of it is that not thinking in dynamical terms fails to give time due credit. And what I mean by that is that hysteresis and the lingering of things that happened before, and the fact that going to a place and going backwards are not always the same, are not just mirror images of each other. These are concepts that we can make quite specific using dynamical systems. So, and which aligns with a certain intuition about things like doing the same thing at two different times of day does not produce the same subjective experience, for instance. When Strogatz has this example of listening to two songs, your two favorite songs at the same time does not produce double the enjoyment. I like that example a lot, because there's a type of linearity that is sort of the baseline reductionist assumption, which I highly recommend people always start with when doing modeling, in order to subsequently throw it out. You know, is that the time at which you do something matters because all kinds of other things are ongoing, and there are sort of consequences in terms of lingering effects, reverberations, and things like that matter more. And they're not just distractions like echoes in some concert hall. You can think of things like working memory in terms of the reverberation of something that happened earlier, for instance. And it can be a useful physical metaphor for things that people often tend to talk about in terms of codes or symbols and things like that. I am a big critic of symbols and the metaphor of representation. Not that I think that the brain doesn't do that. It's just that when we posit that, it should be sort of hard won, meaning we have to really exhaust all these other physical ways of thinking before we say, well, that's a code. And you know, that's sort of down the road, but it's just an alternative perspective that keeps time very much at the forefront. Any comments, questions? We can end soon. If
I just wanted to say that, I mean, this is probably my first time speaking this whole session, but I completely back Karthik's mission statement. And also everything that you were saying, Eli, I think that's exactly the flavor that we're looking for in this group. And to like build on ideas like that and to discuss ideas like that, both at a conceptual level, trying to ground those things. And yeah, I'm excited for what's to come.
that's a good note to end on. Unless
I want to say, can I say one thing super quickly?
Sure, Brian, yeah.
Just vibing off of what Charles was bringing up. In my humble opinion, I think that's one of the best things that we can take away from this whole endeavor. So certainly, just to backtrack for a second, I think all of us learning more of the fundamentals in terms of the mathematics underpinning all this stuff, bolstering the foundations for our own research and research we could kind of probe into. That's always useful. At the same time, I think one of the most valuable things we can take away is the fact that this is a group of 20, 30 incredible minds who have some really well-informed and innovative ideas about things in neuroscience, cognitive science, and adjacent areas. And the more that we can kind of build on the ideas that we all bring to the table and see new and interesting things for each other, the more that we can all benefit. So in my view, that's one of the most valuable things that we can take away, is finding ways to bring those ideas together and illuminate that for each other.
I also have a goal as part of this this group effort. As we go further, I want to start speaking less and others speak more. And I shouldn't be that should start happening. It'll be better if that happens. So yeah, that's also another goal.
And ask dumb questions, please. Dumb questions are awesome. Because if you happen to be I don't know what that word means, ask. Yeah. So yeah.
A lot of dumb questions have complicated answers.
That's true. I asked Ryan, I said, Ryan, do you have any good historical sources for where F is equal to MA came from? And that led to a whole interesting conversation. And I read a couple of interesting papers. It's hard to pin down what forces. So, but yeah, you can always hone in on these difficult questions. And since we want to be technical, we can always leave a few minutes at the end for the vaguer, broader questions.
One more just quick thought to throw into the mix. One of my personal interests in all this is taking what we can kind of build up from learning really good fundamentals here, and then bring it to kind of the most ambitious and mysterious questions about high level, in my own interests, high level cognitive and neural models at kind of the most insane scales of complexity, where the big questions reside, that all the really important fundamental research is constitutes building blocks for. So I don't necessarily know where I'm going with that, but to also just throw into the mix, if we can find ways to be ambitious about that and also be humble about what is known and not known, what seems like it could not be known, or where it's just a flaw in understanding certain nuggets or in being innovative about, conceptualizing models that we could then do computational work or experiments on to, just understanding better that space where like the big questions in the field reside is, I think, a good perspective to keep in mind.
Right. Yeah. Those kinds of big topics, I think this crowd will appreciate this sort of thing. There was a neuroscientist named Patricia Sharp who gave a presentation a few years ago at BU about using the attractor metaphor in the context of Buddhist meditation. So she was, I think she's alive. She has been a meditator for a very long time, and one of her side interests was, and she gave a speculative talk about what the benefit of meditation is. So and the way she framed it was something like this: that, okay, you're doing this meditation in a pristine environment, everything's quiet, and you're sitting down and you're comfortable, and let's say you attain a particular state. Well, what good is that? The idea that she proposed is that you're kind of creating a new attractor. And the reason the attractor metaphor is appropriate is even the bad, so a lot of our types of patterns that we want to get away from, which is what often leads people to meditation, are repetitive patterns, which are like attractors in thought space. You find yourself, chewing a sort of cognitive scab, and you don't know how to stop doing that. So the idea was that you're kind of building a different furrow during the meditation, but the only reason or not the only reason, but one key reason that it's a useful furrow is that you're constructing an attractor basin that is accessible from the bus, or when you have road rage or whatever. So those are wild speculative things, and we should understand that.
It's not really wild speculative too, right? Like, if you think about it, that's the very first statement of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, right? Which is saying what? It says, Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha, right? That's the Sanskrit thing. What does it mean? Yoga is the cessation of the thing that starts generating your thoughts. So the Chitta Vritti is basically like a vortex or an attractor or whatever you can think of. So that's basically the very first statement of Yoga Sutra itself, which is the foundation for whatever in an Indian philosophical sense, meditation. So people are kind of getting through to the same concept. They might not have the formal language might be different, but I don't think it's too far-fetched to think about it that way. So yeah, it is very much within the realm of, if you want to construct it as dynamics, you can talk about it in that language if you want. So
if anybody wants to go on a fun journey, there is a Buddhist text, which is a philosophy of mind. It's called the Abhidharma, and it's very interesting. And I think there's a lot of truth in it, and I think it can be very revealing and sort of kind of a different perspective of a similar thing, of the same thing.
Excellent. These are all topics that and that there's a lot there. So we'll definitely return to them over and over again. All right. I think it's a good note to end on. Thank you all for attending. This is a very nice group of people, and hopefully we can also network. And if any kind of cross connections happen, if you need me to be the node for any kind of cross connections, do let me know. And see you next week. We'll do chapter 2 of Strogatz. We'll aim for an hour and a half, and then we'll leave the last 20 minutes for what we just did. Okay then.
Thanks for organizing this.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Johan.
Bye. Have
Thanks,
a good night
everyone.
or day, depending on your time zone.
See you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, see ya.
Yeah.